So we've talked about how colonialism as a historical process really illustrates that idea that Marxist theory has, that the global economy is one in which wealthy states are cooperating to exploit poorer countries. And since we don't have colonialism in that way today, I think it's possible to think, oh well, that's maybe in the past. But there are more contemporary applications of Marxist theory that maybe fit a little bit better with the global economy today. And so I want to introduce a perspective dependency theory that takes some of the ideas of Marxism and looks at the global trading system and sees exploitation rather than prosperity and opportunity. So dependency theory is a view of global trade that emerges in the 1970s when a handful of economists look at what happens in Latin America during the Second World War. Now, Latin America has been in a trading relationship with the United States since the middle part of the 19th century, and the United States had industrialized, and Latin America had predominantly provided raw materials, right? So you ship bauxite into the United States, it gets turned into aluminum, gets turned into consumer goods, and then gets shipped back to Latin America. And that had been what that trade relationship looked like. The United States wealthy, producing finished products, Latin America poor, producing raw materials. And that worked really well in terms of a stable dynamic up until World War II, when a couple things happened. One, submarine warfare makes shipping really, really dangerous. And so commercial shipping to Latin America essentially ends. Number two, the United States gears up for the war effort and shifts over all of its consumer good production away from, export and to the war effort. And so in Latin America, where you used to be able to buy consumer goods like radios, which were the cutting edge technology of 1940 from the United States in your local store, suddenly with the war, you couldn't do that. But there was still demand for radios. And so people began tinkering in their garages and working on things. And after a couple months, radios began showing up on the stores all across Latin America. And they're locally made. Now, they're not great, but as the war effort goes on, they're improving and they're developing brands and they're developing this technology. And then the war effort ends, and General Electric, which had been making radios for the war effort, suddenly shifted its factories back over to making radios for consumers, and they flood into Latin America, and overnight the radio industry in Latin America is gone, destroyed, disappears, doesn't exist anymore. And these economists looked at this and said, it's not that the United States has something special going for it that makes it an industrialized power that Latin American countries don't have. It's not like they can't make radios. We've demonstrated empirically that they can master this technology and produce this technology. But instead, what seems to be happening is that Latin American countries are locked in a dependent relationship with the United States. Not dependent in that they're getting things from the United States, but that their economies are reliant upon the United States for finished goods. And because they're relying upon the United States for finished goods, they're not developing those finished goods internally. And so the sort of policy solution that gets put forward by these economists is what's called import substitution. The idea is that if you want to industrialize your economy, you can't do it while you are tied into a global trading system, because there will always be cheap foreign goods that will undercut your domestic production and you'll never get it off the ground. And so if you want to have a shot at industrialization, you need to block imports that are coming into your country and tell your, local population, figure it out. Just harness your entrepreneurial spirit, figure out how to create radios, figure out how to build computers, figure out how to do whatever you need to do to have the things that you want. We're generating all this capacity internally. And even if it's inefficient, right, even if it's, the radios aren't as good or they cost more, that's a small price to pay, because that's going to be what it takes to start the wheels of industrialization rolling within your country. And unless you do that, you will never break that dependent relationship with the wealthy country. And so a number of countries in Latin America try this kind of dynamic over the course of, the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s on up into the early 1990s. Mexico tries this, Argentina tries this, not with great success. And part of the problem is that it's really hard to be able to produce everything on your own. And so as economists began going back over some of this initial data on Latin America, they noticed that, yeah, your industrial sector does start producing radios. You do start seeing these new industries popping up, but as a whole, the economy goes into a really hard recession because everything's costing more, because you have to produce it on your own, because you don't get economies of scale, because you have to invest in all the different technologies rather than sharing technology around the world. And all of that cumulatively adds up to a crushing weight on your economy that's made it really hard for any country to be able to pull off import substitution successfully. But if you look at that dynamic and say poor countries do seem to be stuck in this dynamic where they're not able to compete against fully industrialized countries, then you might take the view that something needs to be done to help developing countries sort of break that pattern, break that cycle, and spark industrialization. And so about the time that some countries were experimenting with import substitution, the G77 put forward a new set of economic policies called the New International Economic Order, NIEO, sometimes, which people don't necessarily talk about much anymore, but really has been a set of policy goals that poor countries have been pushing for pretty relentlessly for decades, to try to restructure the global economy in a way that seems less exploitive, that seems more fair, that seems to give poorer countries better access to jumpstarting industrialization. So one of those is trade reform. And we certainly have seen this with the World Trade Organization and that Doha round, which has been all aimed at trying to restructure global trade in a way that will help poor countries, specifically by giving poor countries access to a fair global trading system for agriculture. Wealthy countries tend to support and protect their agricultural industries. Poor countries would like that to stop. They would like to have access to those markets. They would like to be able to sell in, and that would be a successful way to generate revenue if only they had access to those markets. Secondly, poor countries have pointed to the instability in the global currency system, right? And how, as the global economy has shifted away from fixed exchange rates backed by gold and by the dollar to floating exchange rates. If you're a small country, if you are a commodity dependent country, the value of your currency can fluctuate a lot as shifts in global commodity prices change, as speculators come in and bet on your currency. And so there's been calls by poor countries to have greater tools and greater control over the value of their currency and stabilizing that value. There have been calls to reform how the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank are governed. The World Bank is always run by an American, and the International Monetary Fund is always run by a European, because the United States and its European allies hold enough votes in these two organizations to essentially run them. Poor countries have looked at that and said these organizations set policies that have huge implications on poor countries, and poor countries don't have a voice in how they're run, in what they're doing, in how they operate, and that needs to change by rewriting the formulas that undergird these organizations. Poor countries have called for relaxing patent laws to allow for rapid transfer of technology to poor countries. Particularly, this was a real concern when it came to medicine to combat HIV/AIDS, particularly in Africa, where incidents of HIV/AIDS in the early 1990s were reaching epidemic levels, and without access to the antiviral drugs, there was really no way to stop the spread and stop the rapid expansion of that disease. And so the thinking is you've got these essentially protections preventing knowledge from filtering into the developing world through patent laws. That's something that's a really easy thing to relax and trade off to help poor countries. Poor countries have called for labor migration to increase migration from poor countries to rich countries, to allow workers to work in rich countries. Remittances end up being a source of huge revenue for a lot of poor countries. One of the top sources of foreign currency in Mexico and in Bangladesh and others is people from those countries going to other countries, working and sending cash home, and that cash fuels the local economy. Labor migration would have a huge impact on the global economy in terms of expanding the global economy. Some people estimate by as much as $50 to $100 trillion more in terms of global economic production if we were relaxing labor migration um, restrictions, just because it would be so much more efficient to have folks able to move where there are jobs. And poor countries have really advocated for that as a one of many tools that they can have to help improve their economic situation. Poor countries have pushed back against economic coercion, right? The use of sanctions as a tool to force states to hold to a set of policies. Poor countries have looked at this and said, you're telling us that the global economy is not an exploitive system in which rich countries force poor countries to do what they want, and yet sanctions are regularly used as tools against poor countries. If we are truly in an economy that's not, exploitive, that shouldn't be happening. And so there's been sort of pushback against that. There's been calls for rethinking the global development system, right? There has been a push to increase levels of development assistance to as much as 0.7% of GDP for wealthy countries. Currently, many wealthy countries, developed countries, only contribute about 0.1% of GDP to international development assistance, which is a fraction of a penny of every dollar produced. And there's an argument to be made that if you can ramp up that, the ability to meet those Millennium Development Goals and those Sustainable Development Goals would greatly be improved if the resources were simply in place. And then lastly, poor countries have pushed back against the massive accumulation of debt that's occurred over the 70, 80 years that the World Bank has been in operation, where poor countries were told, just take out these loans because under the Herrera-Domer model, you'll get increasing capital, you'll get machines, you'll get productive economic growth. And yet oftentimes that growth didn't follow. And so poor countries have amassed, really crushing levels of debt. And there's a sense that perhaps this debt, which was accumulated under sort of flawed economic thinking in terms of what would spark development, should maybe be renegotiated or forgiven as a way of helping developing countries sort of get a leg up. And so poor countries have sort of pushed back against the Washington consensus and the agendas that have been pushed by wealthy industrialized countries and said, look, the global economy isn't working for us. It hasn't worked for us historically. And if you wanted to make it a system that was going to be less exploitive and where we would actually have a chance of breaking out of some of these dependent relationships, these are the kind of things that would help us be successful.